Hi everyone, my name is Lily and I'm a policy analyst with the Women's Healthy Environments Network. And today I'm going to be talking about the newly enacted Right to a Healthy Environment under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. But before I get into my explanation of the right and the act, I first want to talk about a concept that's central to our discussion today. And that's the concept of environmental justice. So environmental justice is a movement that advocates for the fair distribution of environmental benefits such as clean air and environmental burdens like pollution. It focuses on making sure that marginalized groups, particularly poor, racialized, and Indigenous communities, have a voice in decisions about environmental issues that impact them. Certain communities often unfairly suffer from pollution and environmental harm due to both systemic and social factors like race, class, and gender. This is called environmental injustice. There are many instances of environmental injustice in Canada. In Nova Scotia, environmentally dangerous projects like dumps, landfills, and pulp and paper mills are more likely to be located near African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq communities. These communities suffer from higher rates of both cancer and respiratory illness. Women and gender diverse peoples, specifically women of color, are at greater risk of being harmed by toxic chemicals found in personal care products that have both cancerous and reproductive effects. In First Nations communities, the number of waterborne infections is 26 times higher than that in the national average, and about 30% of reserve-based community water systems are considered to be at high risk for poor water quality. Now, these are some pretty scary facts, but currently there is a significant opportunity to advance environmental justice in Canada, and that is the update of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to include the right to a healthy environment. So in June of 2023, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, was updated for the first time in 20 years. As part of this update, it now recognizes that everyone in Canada has the right to a healthy environment. The Government of Canada is required to develop an implementation framework for this right by June of 2025. This framework will define the right and set out how it will be considered in decision-making under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So we are currently in the third stage of the implementation process. In early October, the government released a draft implementation framework, and as of right now, we are in the public engagement and consultation period for feedback on the draft, which is why we're all here today. The final stage of the implementation process will take place in June of 2025 when the final implementation framework is released. Now, I know I've said the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and CEPA many times so far, so you might be wondering what this actually is. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, as we like to call it, is a federal law that aims to contribute to sustainable development through pollution prevention. It also strives to protect environmental and human health from the risks associated with toxic substances. It covers things like assessing and controlling risks from chemicals, plastics, and living organisms, managing programs that address air and water pollution, hazardous waste, and emissions from pollutants and greenhouse gases, and regulating the dumping of waste into the ocean, as well as responding to environmental emergencies. In short, CEPA ensures that harmful substances and pollution are properly managed to protect both the health of the environment and people's health. Now, the CEPA management cycle is a process that helps prevent pollution and protect people and the environment from the harmful effects of pollution. There are 6 stages in this cycle. The first is research and monitoring, then we have risk assessment, risk management, compliance promotion, enforcement, and finally, performance measurement, evaluation, and reporting. And each of these stages is supported by public participation, cooperation between different levels of government, and Indigenous consultation. So now let's take mercury as an example to better understand how the CEPA management cycle even works. So for those of you who don't know, mercury is a natural metal used in things like thermometers and fluorescent lights, but it becomes toxic when it enters our bodies, where it can harm the nervous system, kidneys, and our immune systems. The main route of exposure to mercury for humans is through fish consumption and through consumption of other wildlife species. So a risk assessment was conducted by the Government of Canada on mercury, finding that the substance posed threats to environmental and human health. It was then added to the list of toxic substances in CEPA, and the government then outlined a risk management strategy to prevent, control, and ideally eliminate exposure to mercury. But it's important to note that the CEPA management cycle doesn't always work as it's intended, resulting in negative impacts to environmental and human health. So put simply, CEPA aims to work like this. First, we find out if something's dangerous. Then we make a plan to manage that danger and fix it. Then we put that plan into action, make sure people are following it, then check if the plan's working, and finally make changes if necessary. So you might be wondering who is even responsible for enforcing CEPA and for carrying out the different stages of the management cycle. So when it comes to environmental matters in Canada, each level of government is responsible for different things. The municipal government deals with issues concerning the local community, such as public parks, garbage removal, and recycling. Then if we move to the next level, the provincial government is responsible for issues that affect the province as a whole, such as ensuring public drinking water is safe, except on First Nations reserves where that's the responsibility of the federal government. And then finally, the federal government is responsible for issues that affect Canada as a whole country, such as pollution prevention through federal legislation, including the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So we've talked about the Act. Now you might be wondering what the right to a healthy environment under CEPA means and how the government defines it. So according to the definition provided by the federal government in the draft implementation framework, the right will have both substantive and procedural elements. The substantive elements, which refer to the actual rights and duties people have, include living in an environment that is protected from harmful substances, pollutants, and waste, and where actions taken under CEPA contribute to clean and healthy air and water, a sustainable climate, and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. The procedural elements of the right, which refer to how the system works to enforce these rights and duties, include access to information, participation in decision-making, and then finally, access to effective remedies in the event of environmental harm. The framework also acknowledges that Indigenous peoples have a special connection to their land and resources, which is an important factor in protecting the right to a healthy environment. It's also important to note that the right to a healthy environment will only apply to activities within CEPA. So this means that it won't apply to decisions made under other federal or provincial laws, regardless of if those decisions affect environmental and human health. So for example, the Pest Control Products Act, which regulates pesticides, won't have to consider the right to a healthy environment when determining if a potentially harmful pesticide should be approved. So now, don't worry if you haven't read the draft implementation framework. I'm going to go over 5 key aspects of it right now. So the first key takeaway from the draft implementation framework is the implementation. So how will the right to a healthy environment even be implemented? The draft framework identifies key points in decision-making where the right to a healthy environment can be considered under CEPA. It also lists tools and policies that the federal government currently uses or plans to use to protect this right. So for example, the draft framework suggests adding a new step to the CEPA management cycle where researchers must consider how the right to a healthy environment will be considered in their research. So how the research protects the right. Each year, CEPA requires the federal government to also report on how the right is being implemented. And this is done in the CEPA annual report, which is submitted to Parliament and posted online. Now, the next key takeaway is the introduction of 3 key principles that will be added to CEPA to help protect the right to a healthy environment. So the first of these principles is environmental justice, which essentially means making sure those most vulnerable to environmental harm are protected. Then we have non-regression, so that's ensuring environmental protections don't weaken over time. And then finally, intergenerational equity, which essentially means considering the needs of future generations and the future state of the environment. Simply put, these principles are aimed at making sure the right protects those most vulnerable to environmental harm, prevents any backward steps in regulation, and then finally takes into account future populations and the future state of the environment. So now the next key takeaway, the relevant factors and reasonable limits. So the right to a healthy environment is not absolute and is further restricted by reasonable limits. According to the federal government, reasonable limits should be explained clearly and fairly, taking into account all relevant factors and CEPA principles. These relevant factors include social, economic, health, environmental and scientific factors, and they'll be considered both when determining the reasonable limits and also when interpreting and applying the right. So the next key takeaway is the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge. A new policy framework is proposed in the draft framework to guide the integration of Indigenous knowledge with Western science in CEPA. This policy framework emphasizes bridging, braiding, and weaving Indigenous knowledge in Western science to inform CEPA decision-making. Here, bridging, braiding, and weaving essentially means respecting, combining, and integrating Indigenous knowledge with Western science. The policy will formalize processes for working with Indigenous communities, ensuring their worldviews, values, and specific knowledge systems are meaningfully incorporated. So now the last takeaway from the draft implementation framework is the accountability. So the right to a healthy environment is not a directly enforceable right. While it's included in CEPA's introduction and it will inform CEPA processes, there are currently no new legal avenues to hold the federal government accountable for violating one's right to a healthy environment. An online portal will be introduced to allow the public to submit questions and feedback on the right. However, it's not specified that the government must act on this feedback. So this is how the government defines the right to a healthy environment under CEPA. But what does that mean to you? That's what we're here to discuss. But before we get into that, I just wanted to go over why we specifically as young people should even care about this policy framework and what the importance of being here today and sharing your perspectives is. So decisions made today directly impact the lives of young people in ways that's different from older generations. I know my parents and even my grandparents didn't have the same anxieties as me about everyday exposures to toxins, pollution, and the looming threat of a global climate disaster. Today, young people in particular often experience disproportionate burdens when it comes to coping with pollution, exposure to toxic chemicals, and the climate crisis. A recent study surveyed 10,000 young people across the globe from 16 to 25 years. It was found that 59% said they were extremely or very worried about climate change, and 45% of respondents said their feelings about climate change affected their daily living. Given these impacts, it is especially important that we have the opportunity to share our voices. This framework affects us, our children, and future generations. We deserve a say in what this framework means for our futures. So considering our unique positions and perspectives as young people, the concept of intergenerational equity is especially important. To reiterate, the principle of intergenerational equity under the draft implementation framework emphasizes that it is important to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. According to the federal government, upholding the principle involves considering the needs of future generations when making decisions today and taking action now so that the costs and burdens of pollution from the current generation are not passed on to future generations. So I want us all to think about what intergenerational equity means to us. Does this definition resonate with us? Does it not? We'll have time to discuss these thoughts and concerns later in our discussion. But to finish off my presentation, I want to just discuss what the importance of being here today is and what the importance of consultation is. Using the feedback we get from these sessions, our organizations will submit a community-based feedback report to the federal government. A policy that only considers one perspective will not effectively serve the diverse communities in our nation. That is to say, your perspectives are incredibly important. So I just wanted to say thank you all for being here today and sharing your perspectives. We're very excited to learn from all of you and to influence this national policy framework together.